Hello, and we're back with the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Emily Rutherford-Liska, Executive Director of the Jacksonville Historical Society, and I'm here with Elizabeth Friedmann. A lot of people know her as Peggy Friedmann. Hello, Peggy.
Hello, Emily.
And Peggy is a writer and an author, and certainly has a passion for certain aspects of Jacksonville history, if not all Jacksonville history. And you're here to talk about one of those aspects today, and it really is riveting what you've done and what you've discovered in your life regarding a shipwreck that was here roughly 12 years ago. And I'm going to let you set the stage for this shipwreck and why it's become so important, and to not just to you, but to Jacksonville history.
Well, the story starts actually in 1895 when Stephen Crane, a young writer, wrote a book called The Red Badge of Courage, which probably most people have heard of because it was an instant bestseller. And he wrote this book. It was about the Civil War, about the American Civil War, but he was born 6 years after the war ended. And so he wrote it out of his imagination, and he said the psychology of the book war psychology came from what he knew about playing football. Oh. So, but he had never seen a battle. And so after he wrote this book and was very famous, and it was praised for its realism, then he was worried that maybe he didn't get it quite right. So he wanted to actually go into battle as a newspaper correspondent. And he'd done a lot of newspaper writing before that. So he came to Jacksonville in November of 1896 to try to book passage to Cuba on one of the filibustering vessels that were going and taking arms and ammunition to the Cuban rebels.
And this was a very dangerous adventure for those gun runners and
yes.
for Stephen Crane.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
But he liked adventure.
Okay.
And Jacksonville was a very exciting place to be in those days.
Well, it was downright romantic for these ships to be running guns and munitions.
And it was a city of conspiracy and intrigue, because the Cuban junta, which was headquartered in New York, had an office in Jacksonville, and everybody in Jacksonville was supporting the Cuban Revolution. So it was an exciting place to be. Mm-hmm. So he came here trying to make his way to Cuba, and he was here for from the end of November until the end of December, when he finally got passage aboard one of the filibustering vessels, and it was called the Commodore. And there were three that were very famous. They were called the Cuban fleet by the newspapermen. One was the Commodore, one was the Dauntless, and one was the Three Friends, which was owned by Napoleon Bonaparte Broward.
Of the bridge fame here,
yes.
Even though everyone calls it the Dames Point
Exactly.
Bridge, it's really the Napoleon Bonaparte Broward Bridge.
And he became the governor of Florida.
Now we want to show a close shot both of Stephen Crane and the Commodore, and it's been done. I'm sorry, I missed that myself, so that's wonderful. Okay, so now everybody's seen that. Go ahead. The story's wonderful. Please keep going.
So what happened was the Commodore left on New Year's Eve of 1896 and headed out the St. Johns River. And at Commodore's Point, ironically, because it was already called Commodore's Point, where the Hart Bridge is now,
yes.
It ran aground, and it was stuck in the mud overnight. And finally it was pulled off the next morning and went steaming on out of Mayport, heading for Cuba. But during the time that it was stuck in the mud, there was some damage probably done to the hull of the ship, because off Daytona Beach the ship began to take on water, and the bilge pumps were not working properly. And so they were trying to pump the water out, and they couldn't.
And Peggy, they're showing this document now. Does this relate at all to what you're talking about now?
Yes, this is a document. This was the temporary registration for the Commodore that was completed in Jacksonville just before it was cleared to go to Cuba. And it's just a very interesting looking document.
And especially a document out of Jacksonville, Florida.
Exactly.
Showing our relationship with this vessel.
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And of course, when the vessel went down, and there were, I don't know what the next one is. But
That's okay. You can just keep talking, and we'll wait a minute on that one.
The vessel went down off Daytona Beach. Well, there was a lot of discussion whether it was 12 miles or 20 miles, so nobody knew for sure. But it went down, and there were 3 lifeboats. 2 of them made it back to shore. The 3rd one sank, and 8 men perished. Stephen Crane, the cook, the captain, and the boiler person, the person who was shoveling the coal into the engine, the steam, were in a 10-foot dinghy, and they spent 30 hours off the coast of Daytona Beach, and they finally made it into shore.
And people in Jacksonville had given them up for dead.
They had, yes.
This, here he is,
had.
probably the greatest celebrity, one of the greatest celebrities on earth, Stephen Crane at the time, for this literary work, Red Badge of Courage. And suddenly they think he's drowned here.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
So.
And but he made it back. But as they were coming in through the surf, their little dinghy overturned, and one of the men was drowned. So when Stephen Crane got back to Jacksonville, then he was a hero, and everybody was very excited about it. So he had checked into the St. James Hotel as Samuel Carlton. He was trying to be incognito, but of course that didn't work because everybody knew who he was. So when he came back to the hotel, a little girl thrust, there were lots of people in the lobby,
and
you know, clapping, and a little girl thrust an autograph book into his hand, and he wrote, this is what he wrote at the bottom,
on the very bottom
piece of writing.
And we'll see this if we can scroll on down to the bottom, which must have been quite a coup for a little girl to get this autograph from this great celebrity given up for dead.
That's right, and you see what he wrote: Stephen Crane, able seaman, SS Commodore. And then it's dated January 4th, 1897. He you know, a lot of us put the wrong year when the year has just turned, and so he put 1896 and then corrected himself.
What a treasure to have.
And the top photo there is a photo of the Commodore. So that's what it looked like.
The vessel that sank.
The vessel
now,
that sank.
There's way more to this story because you went on a literary dive to find the Commodore, and you were successful. So we have a little time left to talk about that. And would you talk about it? And that's going to be the subject of a speech you deliver on Tuesday, the 23rd of March at the Jacksonville Historical Society, diving for literary treasure, the sinking of the Commodore. So tell us a little bit about your search for the remains of the Commodore.
Well, I was teaching the open boat at Jacksonville University in 1986.
Which is the story, so for those who don't know what the open boat is.
It's the story that Crane wrote, a fictional account, but it's pretty close to what happened to him and those 3 other men in that dinghy during that 30 hours at sea. And it's probably his second most famous piece of writing after the Red Badge of Courage. It's a long, short story, and it's in most American anthologies of American literature. So I was teaching it out of an anthology. And I was also at the time doing a lot of scuba diving, and I was writing travel articles, and scuba diving was my specialty. And so I was teaching that, and I realized that ship still had to be out there, and nobody had ever found it. And I decided that I would put together an expedition and try to find it. And so the first thing I did was to go, well, I knew certain things that I would have to look for, but the first thing I needed to find was a diver who knew offshore Daytona Beach really, really well. And I started asking around at dive shops, and the name that kept coming up was Don Serbosic, because Don had been diving there for ages and ages. So I went down to see him and spoke to him and told him what I was after, and he said, you know, he said, I think I know where that wreck might be. He said, there's a wreck that I always call the old Spanish-American War wreck, and I think that might be what you're looking for. And so I said, will you take me to it? And he said, yes. And so we went, And we dived the wreck. We began to bring up one of the things that that Stephen Crane said in his account of this was that when they turned the boat toward shore, the lighthouse stuck up like a pin.
And we're going to show, this is the lighthouse that Stephen Crane, you felt, saw at that time.
And I wanted to be sure I could see it at the site, and I could, certainly. It was just like a little pinpoint
And if you
sticking
even
up on the
see it
horizon.
from the perspective of being out in the water, the one that's lower here, take a look. So it stuck up like a pin was his literary cue to you.
Yes.
Or clue, I should say.
And I knew I had to see the lighthouse. I also knew I had to find things that were on the manifest. The manifest was published in the Florida Times-Union when the ship left, so I knew what they were carrying. Mostly guns, ammunition, medical supplies, and so we went and we began to bring up artifacts from the wreck, and everything we brought up matched what was on the manifest. For example, we found Remington rifles and Winchester rifles and all the bullets. We found brass studs from the construction of the boat, and everything that we found seemed to match what we were looking for.
And this dive was about 20 years ago, roughly. Am I not correct? And since that time, you've remained interested in Stephen Crane, in the Commodore, and in even another personality that's big in Jacksonville history. I'll let you quickly tell that because we have about a minute and a half left. And that other, because you are writing a book on Stephen Crane and
Cora Crane, who is Cora Taylor in Jacksonville, and who became very well known in Jacksonville after Crane died. She lived with him as his common law wife for 3 years at the end of his life, and he died at the age of 28.
And as a scholar of Cora and Stephen, you would probably prefer me not to identify her in one sentence of saying she was the leading madam of the town, but...
No, that's what she was.
Oh, good. I'm glad I got
That's exactly what she was. But not when Stephen Crane met her. This happened after he died, and she came back because she tried to make her living as a writer, and she was not able to. And so she came back to Jacksonville and opened the fanciest sporting house in town.
And do you go ahead.
And became a real legend. But she's a fascinating character. She's just been so much fun to research.
Well, I know you're working on a book on Cora Crane now. We cannot wait. I want to thank you, Peggy Friedmann, for being here. And for those of you who want to hear more from Peggy, please show up at the Jacksonville Historical Society Tuesday, March 23rd, because we will have a program on the wreck of the Commodore, diving for literary treasure, the full story by Peggy Friedmann, our guest today. I want to thank both of my guests, both Dorothy Fletcher and Peggy Friedmann. Jacksonville's proud to have these wonderful writers. Thank you for being with us. That's all for now. See you later on the Jacksonville History Show.